Okay, so we gave Cometic head gaskets a call, and they suggested retorquing the head before completely pulling it off, because that usually fixes problems like these since the leak is so small. It's possible that one of the head stud bolts is just loosened up. So we started by removing the Magnuson coolant bottle, the coil packs. You'll need a 10mm ratchet for that. Pop those off, remove the electrical connectors, pop off the wiring harness from the valve cover, just little plastic tabs that pop out. And there's 10 8mm bolts. You remove those and the valve cover will come off. And this allows access to the ARP head studs right there. And using the ARP torque pattern, we're just going to retorque the head studs. Okay, retorquing the head didn't solve our problem. All the head studs were at 105 foot-pounds like they should have been. So now we're going to start taking the blower off the car. And this is the original version of the Magnuson, so it separates at the tub and the upper portion. And there are about 17 of these 10mm bolts that have to come out. The hardest one being the one that goes from down to up underneath the blower snout. You'll also want to disconnect all the injectors, map sensor, IAT, any hoses or other connections, and pinch off the coolant lines. You got a fuel line in the back you want to be aware of. You can either pop it off and catch the fuel that trickles out in a rag, or you can do the decompression sequence, which is pull the fuel pump relay and crank the car till it stalls. So we got the blower removed from the lower tub. I'm about to take the lower tub off, and it's just 10mm bolts. Be careful of the O-ring if you have one of these older versions of the Magnuson Supercharger. The new ones don't come apart. It's one piece that just sits on there and everything bolts in one spot. There's the blower taking off the car. Be careful managing the coolant. You want to cap up the coolant hoses. And here we just tied the coolant hoses together for the intercooler to keep anything from leaking. And removing these tub bolts, be very careful, don't drop them down the intake. Okay, next you want to drain the coolant. Save it in a clean container if you're going to reuse it. I'm actually going to put fresh coolant in mine. And you want to remove your rockers, starting from the middle bolts and work your way out. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And they're marked intake on the top and exhaust on the bottom. And the push rods are different lengths, so be careful to mark where they came out of the engine and in the exact order they came out. You're going to put them back in the exact same slots they came out of. When you're taking these rockers out, be careful not to remove the retainer. Yep. When you pull the push rods out, you want to make sure to mark where they went. We got a box marked front, left side, and right side. So that's exactly how they all came out of the engine. The longer push rods are the exhaust side, in case you mix them up, but you want to try to get them back in the exact same hole that they came out of. There's what the heads look like with the rocker arms and push rods removed. And next we'll take the ARP head studs out and try to remove the heads. You will need to remove the power steering pump from the driver's side head. It is 3 12mm bolts. And you can do a leak down test without pulling the rocker arms and the push rods, but with the rocker arms and push rods removed, all the valves are closed. So it's easier to do a leak down test. So we're going to do it from here and just kind of see what we see. Okay, today I'm going to show you how to do a leak down test. We've got a Lang leak down gauge, and it comes with a open hose that will thread into a spark plug hole. On this particular car, we're hunting a possible head gasket issue, so we've got the whole valve train out of the head, so all the valves are closed. In a normal circumstance there on this test, you'd want to find top dead center of the cylinder and make sure it's on the compression stroke. So you could put a little piece of paper or something in one of the spark plug holes and turn the engine over with the ratchet, and when the paper blows out of the hole, you know you're on the compression stroke and both valves are closed. And then you can put a wooden dowel or something down in the spark plug hole until you see it come up to its highest point, and you know you're at top dead center. You want to have, on the Hemi we've got 2 spark plugs per cylinder, so you want to have one spark plug in one of the cylinder holes and the other one open. You want to thread the tool into the other spark plug hole. Alright, next you want to hook up shop air and set your shop air to about 100 psi. And then using this knob, you want to zero out this side. Sometimes they're a little touchy, so just try to get it as close as you can and then lock it. Next, just hook the gauge up to the air tube that goes into the cylinder and take your reading. This cylinder has about 5% leak down, which is good. Now we're going to drain the coolant so we can start pulling the heads off. There's a petcock. If you remove the plastic shields from under the car, it's 7mm bolts and about 4 or 5 plastic pull tabs. Then you just unloosen the drain petcock and let it drain out. Loosening the cap on the overflow bottle will help it drain faster. Now we have the coolant drain, we're going to remove the ARP head stud bolts. We're going to use a snap-on head stud socket, and it's a 14mm 12-point. And you notice how it's tapered so we can get around all the valve springs and everything. And you normally wouldn't use a torque wrench to break head stud bolts loose, but the snap-on one can do it without messing up the torque specifications on it. We loosened all of the head nuts, starting from the center and working our way out. We're not going to remove the actual nut off of the stud because there's no need to. You can just back out the stud itself using a number 5 metric hex head Allen wrench, and they're only finger tight when they go in, so they'll just come right out. It probably doesn't matter, but you know how anal we are. We went ahead and put all of the head studs in a box in the exact locations as they came out of the head, so we can put them back in the same spot when we reassemble. To pull the head, you can just remove the 16mm exhaust flange bolts and leave the header attached to the head, and it should be able to wiggle out between the fender and the engine. After the two 16mm exhaust stud nuts are removed, the head will just lift right off with the header attached, as long as you have either the original RT shorties on there or SRT8 shorties. If you have long tube headers, you probably have to remove the header bolts first. And here's a look at the valves and the head. And we didn't really see anything that obvious. So while it's still possible there was a small leak somewhere in the head gasket, nothing really shows up under inspection. What we're looking for are any areas where these lines are crossed, or one of the coolant jackets in here. So now we got both heads off. We didn't see any obvious problems. We're going to send the heads off for inspection at a machine shop for Magnaflux, and they're going to check them for flat and then reassemble it. So this is a passenger side head. Cylinder 2, 4, 6, and 8. We sent the heads off and had them pressure checked. They didn't find any problems, so they just cleaned them up. We got new exhaust, header gaskets, intake gaskets for the blower tub, as well as rubber O-rings for the supercharger itself, and we're about to start the reinstall. When we compared the SRT8 gaskets that are going on the RT heads, Arrington had removed 2 of the metal layers and just used the soft end layer. So that's what we're going to do, since it had worked before. We just filed off the rivet and push it out. Okay, the head mating surface has been cleaned up with some acetone and a lint-free rag. And we've checked for any leftover gasket material, nothing like that. I've test fit the Cometic gasket, and one of these rivets isn't going to clear the block in the very back. So we're going to use a grinder and just very gently grind that down flush. The other ones were okay, so we're going to leave them. Okay, so we've set the heads back on the motor. And one tip I'll say is if you use one of your studs, or if you shave off a bolt kind of in the middle of the head, it'll kind of give you a guide to help you set the head back down on the engine square. You just want to make sure you don't catch on any of the wiring harnesses or the exhaust system below. We've also run all of the head studs in finger tight. And next we'll go through the torque sequence. On the ARP head studs, you want to make sure you use some of their Ultra Torque lube. It helps ensure that the torque values are correct. There's been tests done that actually show it works. And as I said, we just ran the studs actually in finger tight, and we put a little bit of the ARP torque lube on the threads before putting the nut on. Okay, so all the head studs have been torqued following the ARP bolt torque sequence. And you want to do it in thirds. So I did 45 foot-pounds on each one in the sequence provided, 75 foot-pounds, and then finished off with 105 on the larger 14mm bolts. And on the smaller ones, I started from the center and went out like that to 25 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and install the spark plugs before we reinstall the rocker assemblies to prevent anything falling into the motor. And then we'll move on to the rocker assemblies and the push rods. Okay, we've prepared the blower tub in the interim. We've got the new O-ring rope installed, as well as the small rubber O-rings. And on mine, I set the slit in this rope. It's 2 pieces and you just fit it down in there. I'm sorry, it's 1 whole piece, but you cut it and fit it to the blower tub. And I've made the opening be right at the front, where if I ever have a leak or anything, I can see it quickly and easily and know what it is. And I'll put a little RTV silicone over that slit to seal the 2 halves together. And I'll rub a little bit of grease around the top to have it ready to go for install. Next, we're going to install the push rods and the rocker arms. We had marked the box when we removed them front, so we know which one was driver's side and which one was passenger side. We also punched holes in the box and put the rocker arms in the exact locations they came out of. You want to be sure and put them back together in the same spots you removed them. Okay, so we have the push rods and the rocker arms back in place. You just want to slide the push rods into the proper hole and then set your rocker arms down, and starting in the middle, gently tighten the 10mm bolts from the center out, 2, 3, 4, 5, and make sure that the pad is over the top of the valve seat and that the push rod, try to get a shot of it, is centered in the pocket underneath. And then you go back and you torque them to 22 Newton meters, starting from the center out. Not very much torque at all on those. Next, we're going to reinstall the valve cover. And you may have to move some of these wires and hoses around to give you some room. The passenger side is pretty tight back on this back corner. And then starting in the center and working your way out, tighten the 8mm bolts to 70 inch-pounds. Now we're ready to put the supercharger tub on. And we started by installing the intake gaskets, and then we'll put the supercharger tub on top of that, followed by the 10mm bolts, and torque them to 106 inch-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Okay, we got the tub and the supercharger on. We've got 16 or 17 of these little 10mm bolts. You're going to torque those down to 106 inch-pounds, and again you're going to start in the center and do a crisscross pattern working your way out. Make sure you have your torque wrench set to inch-pounds and not foot-pounds. And I will say again that this Magnuson Supercharger is a version 1. It's one of the very first ones that they made for the Dodge Challenger. So this one had the tub and the upper blower assembly as 2 separate pieces. The new ones are much easier to install because they're all one unit. The bottom and the top are bolted together at Magnuson, and you just set the whole thing on the car and bolt it to the heads. We also went ahead and reinstalled the power steering pump and tightened the 10mm bolts to 21 foot-pounds per factory specification. Okay, so now we've just gone around, we've hooked up all 8 injectors. Got those hooked up, we've got our vacuum lines hooked up. Belt is installed, PCV system's installed and hooked up to the catch can. Fuel lines, map sensor, all the other lines. So you just want to look over the car. We attach the heater hoses to the block in the specified spots. There's one, I think you can barely see it. It's right there. Now we're about to install the air cleaner. Now you want to come underneath the car and reconnect your exhaust system with the 16mm bolts on the exhaust studs for the headers. Next, you want to drain the oil, because when you pull the heads off, there will be some antifreeze that mixes in. So you want to get fresh oil in the motor before firing it up. Okay, so we got the motor reassembled. We have all the connectors hooked up, the exhaust is hooked up. We're about to try the first start after reassembly. We're going to check the fuel pressure first by turning the ignition key on. Yep, got fuel pressure. I was going to bump it a couple of times, make sure everything's okay. All right. There it is. Everything looks good. Checking for any leaks. There's a little bit of smoke from all the oil and everything, it's on all the parts. Other than that, good to go. Okay, so after all of that, we still had the problem. So we fired the car up and we're kind of checking it for leaks and everything. It was still pressurizing the coolant overflow bottle. And what we noticed while checking for leaks, we saw the lower radiator hose was collapsing. You can probably barely see it. It kind of hides underneath the engine down there. So I called a buddy of mine who has the exact same setup as I do, same engine, same supercharger, same pulley, same everything. And I had him check his car, and sure enough, his lower radiator hose was collapsing as well. So what we theorize is happening is these cars have a 17% overdrive crank pulley. And that's in order to get the maximum amount of boost out of the supercharger. So that means it's spinning the supercharger, the power steering pump, and the water pump 17% faster. So the water pump is drawing from the bottom of the radiator up to the water pump and into the engine. And the factory hose must have just been at its limit and probably had been collapsing ever since we built the car. And it's just something you never look at because it's hidden underneath the motor. And over time, with it expanding and collapsing, it weakened my hose enough that it collapsed all the way, which stopped flow and backed it up into the overflow bottle. So what we did to fix it is, first of all, we got a new hose, but we also put a spring inside that lower radiator hose. Most older cars have those in there from the factory. I guess on the newer cars they're not doing that anymore for some reason. And spinning that just a little bit faster must have been enough to collapse it. So we put a galvanized steel spring inside the hose. You have to be careful what you use. Don't use coat hanger or something silly, or it'll rust and give you problems. You have to use something stainless steel or galvanized steel. And that solved our problem. So as you saw, our problem is solved. So this is one of the reasons I enjoy working on cars. It gives me an opportunity to continue to learn things, and I learned a lot on this particular repair. Diagnosing it, it was quite a bit, frustrating trying to figure out what the actual problem was, and we went through a lot of trouble to find out it was just a hose on the bottom of the radiator. But honestly, this is the first car I've really heard of this happening to. And after I put it out on the forums, like Modern Mopar Forum, etc., some people have chimed in that they've had the same problem or seen the same problem on other cars as well. So there may be a bigger issue that people need to look into with those lower radiator hoses, especially on a modified car. Another big thing that I learned is trust your diagnosing tests. We didn't find any combustion gases in the overflow bottle when we did the block check. We also had a good leak down test. So there I could have stopped and started looking at other problems like the water pump or a plug in the cooling system somewhere, lower radiator hose, etc. We did check the front of the radiator, looked inside of it with a mirror. The radiator is clean, the coolant that drained out of it was clean, and the distilled water that we filled it with to test also drained clean. So there's no clogs in the system anywhere. We didn't see any in the block when we had the heads off, etc. So it's definitely, I'm pretty confident it's an issue with spinning that water pump faster. But back to trusting your diagnosing tests. You know, leak down was good, no combustion gases in the overflow bottle. Probably could have gone a different route and looked at other things earlier. The funny thing is, whenever you have pressure in the overflow tank, everyone will say it's a head gasket, me included. That's what I would have said, and that's the reason I went as far with this as I did. In the future, I will trust those tests and look at other things first before going through that much work. If you'd like to check out some other Challenger information, go to my website, www.speedysgarage.net, and I'd like to thank my buddy Joe Agent with Agent Automotive for helping me perform this work. He was invaluable and helped me lift the heads out, get the supercharger off, troubleshooting, brainstorming, just an all-around great guy. If you have some car issues and you want a good shop local to the Middle Tennessee area, be sure to check him out, agentautomotive.com. I also want to thank Arrington Engines in Martinsville, Virginia. They're the guys that originally assembled this engine for me. It actually came with a 3-year, 36,000 mile warranty, which it is still under, and they offered to fix this for me if I could get the car to them. However, I decided I would try to fix it myself, but they still stood behind me with support and sent me any gaskets, new head gaskets, intake gaskets, etc. Anything I needed, they had it to me pretty much the next day. Thanks again, Arrington.